From NPR and WBUR, I'm Scott Tong in Washington, D.C.
I'm Robin Young in Boston. It's Here and Now. A handful of voters in a handful of swing states will decide the future of this country, and the presidential campaigns are on a scavenger hunt to find them. Zach Schultz is a reporter for PBS Wisconsin. We are outlawing phrases like razor thin, tight as a tick to describe this race there. Am I right? It is tight.
Absolutely. Every piece of polling we've seen shows that it's a toss-up. It's been within the margin of error essentially since President Biden stepped aside and Kamala Harris became the nominee for the Democrats. The polling may change by a point or two in one direction each given week, but essentially, yes, it's going to be a toss-up. It'll go late into the night on election night before we know anything, if it's not even the day after.
Right. But we may know a little more ahead of time than in prior elections. Early voting for Wisconsin started on Tuesday. More than 97,000 people voted. That's up from 2020 when Donald Trump kind of demonized any form of voting, but in-person voting. And he's had such a mixed message this time. If I could paraphrase, vote early, get out and vote early. What did you see? Can you tell if you saw more Republican early voting than perhaps in 2020 when he said it was dangerous only?
Absolutely. A lot of the rural counties in Wisconsin, some of the smaller counties that are definitely more red, did have a larger turnout on the first day of early absentee in-person voting. And Wisconsin doesn't register voters according to party, so we can't look at those kind of returns to figure out who may be showing up. But we can look at where we know more Republicans live than Democrats, and we can definitely see that there was higher turnout there than in the past. Wisconsin's state party chair was the first one nationally to encourage Republicans to go back to voting absentee, voting early, even before the Trump campaign came in line with that. So it's been a message that's been pushed early and often in Wisconsin, and both parties saw record turnout, so much that it slowed down the state servers that allow local clerks to print off the stickers that go on the absentee ballot envelopes. Yeah. There was actually a slowdown. So we've already seen, between all votes, absentee everywhere, we're almost at 500,000 votes cast already.
Well, that's the message now after, tearing their hair out after 2020. Zach, your state is really going with election science. They know either the counties where Trump could have done better in 2020 or Harris can potentially, get more blue voters this time around. They've got it narrowed down to blocks, What are they each trying to do?
Well, the message that we've heard from both parties is that the difference in 2020 was so small that it turns out it's 2 or 3 voters per ward across the state. So the message is any particular group, any particular corner of the state could make the difference. And so there's no group that can be left out of, well, we don't have to worry about this turnout or that turnout. And while you can say, yes, it could come down to African-American turnout in Milwaukee, or could turn out to be white working class rural turnout in northern Wisconsin, or suburban soccer moms, it's literally every group can make the difference when you're talking about a 20,000 vote margin out of 3.3 million votes cast.
And what are undecided voters saying to you?
Undecided voters try not to pay attention to the election until they absolutely have to. And so many of the people in Wisconsin, there's just only about 10%. It's a small sliver that are true independents that say they vote for the candidate. And for a lot of them, politics doesn't overwhelm their lives. They tune in at the end and they feel it's a civic duty to go vote. And then they're often trying to catch up and figure out what can they trust in terms of the messaging, because they're not as tuned in on a daily basis. So they feel an obligation to go vote. But then at the end, they're trying to figure out what should I be listening to and which races matter and what do I trust. And when you've got a repeat candidate or, in the terms of Vice President Kamala Harris, you've got someone who's been elected as part of the Biden ticket, they're having to reevaluate, well, how did I feel? I mean, the message of how were you better off 4 years ago does resonate with a lot of these voters who tune in at the last minute.
Also, real brief, tight race for senator there. Just tell us why.
So Tammy Baldwin's a two-time incumbent Democrat senator. She's being challenged by Eric Hovde, who is a self-funding multimillionaire. Baldwin's hitting him as being an out-of-state carpetbagger because he owns a bank in California, but he actually has long family roots in Wisconsin. He just moved away to make some of his fortune. And it's tightening up because we are no longer seeing voters differentiate as much between different parts of the ballot. So as Republicans come home for Trump, they are coming home for Hovde, at least according to the polling, even though in past elections, Tammy Baldwin has done really well outstate with some of those voters who will split their tickets. So it tightens up in the polls, whether it tightens up on Election Day. Most people here expect Tammy Baldwin to actually run ahead of Harris, whether that means winning by a little bit, winning by a lot, or actually if they're both losing. But those are separate races.
That's Zach Schultz with PBS Wisconsin. He's been covering the Badger State for more than 2 decades. Zach, thank you.
Thank you.
In Russia, at least 3,000 troops from North Korea are now training. That's according to the Pentagon. Defense officials say it's uncertain whether those troops will join the war in Ukraine, but if they do, they would be, quote, legitimate military targets. Missy Ryan joins us now. She covers national security for the Washington Post. Hi, Missy.
Hi, Scott.
So this announcement from the U.S. follows claims by South Korea and Ukraine about North Korean troops allying with Russia. Specifically, what did they say the North Korean soldiers are doing?
Well, according to the U.S. government, which yesterday came out with its first independent confirmation of what it says is the presence of North Korean troops in Russia, the purpose of the broader purpose of the deployment is unclear, but the current activity that U.S. officials described yesterday is training right now. And so they said that there were at least 3,000 troops had been taken from North Korea into eastern Russia and were being given sort of basic military training. And U.S. officials, they declassified information for the first time yesterday, sort of confirming these earlier reports from South Korea and Ukraine. And they said it's not clear yet whether the purpose is to send these North Korean forces who don't have combat experience into Ukraine to fight alongside of Russian forces there, or potentially to send them into other parts of Russia, for example, into the Kursk region, where Ukrainian forces have now taken over part of southern Russia.
Yeah. Are there any claims by Ukraine or by South Korea that North Korean troops are already on the battlefield?
Yes, as a matter of fact. So, we had yesterday, I was in Rome with Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, who was the first U.S. official to confirm that this American intelligence existed. And then we had the White House talk about it yesterday. But what has happened between then and now is that the Ukrainian government, who obviously has an interest in kind of banging the drum and drawing attention to this, because this is sort of an amplification of the threat that they're facing from Russia, potentially. The Ukrainian government is saying that those forces, at least some of them, have already shown up in Kursk, which is the region, as I said, where Ukraine did this sort of counter-invasion earlier this year, and they're seeking to threaten Russian forces and President Vladimir Putin on its home turf.
Yeah. So these North American, North Korean troops, forgive me, whether they're already there or not, how would they benefit Russia in its war in Ukraine?
Yeah, it's unclear because, North Korean forces haven't been in an active war, any sort of ground operations for decades. And so they don't have the same kind of experience. But presumably what they would be doing is kind of just providing additional manpower. The Russian forces have taken massive casualties since they went into Russia in the full-scale invasion in February 2022. They've lost hundreds of thousands of forces to being wounded and being killed. And so President Vladimir Putin is sort of in this bind where he doesn't want to really have to go and authorize additional mobilizations of Russian personnel because it's an unpopular thing. He doesn't want to have to go and mobilize forces from Moscow or some of the other bigger cities. So in theory, the North Korean troops could relieve some of that pressure, potentially either by replacing Russian forces in Kursk and freeing up Russian forces to go into Ukraine, or even being sent into Ukraine itself. And according to the U.S. government, they just don't know yet which of those two scenarios is the most likely.
Yeah. Now the U.S. Defense Secretary says we're talking about 3,000 or so North Korean troops. In the context of this war, is that a lot?
No, it's a really small number. So you do have to question what the overall impact is. I think it's a negligible impact. I think it's more symbolic potentially of the number one, the weaknesses and the challenges that Putin is facing now. We're getting close to 3 years into this war, and then also a sign of the kind of new or strengthened alliances that the war in Ukraine has brought about. We've seen Russia increasingly isolated globally, and so they've had to kind of go to countries that it had more testy relationships with in the past and now count on them as core alliances. And that includes North Korea, which has also sent weapons to Russia since the beginning of the invasion, and Iran, which is supplying drones and missiles to Russia for its use in Ukraine.
Yeah, and what would the benefit of all this be to North Korea?
North Korea gets a number of different things from Russia. It gets help with its advanced weapon systems. It gets technology. Remember, North Korea is subject to global sanctions. They're, this nuclear outlaw, and so they get some help from a big advanced military, and also they get some sort of legitimacy. For Kim Jong-un to be there, standing next to Vladimir Putin, a major global power. That the two countries recently signed a defense deal. It gives him legitimacy and stature, and I think that that's another element here.
Yeah. And briefly, what might the U.S. do if indeed North Korean troops enter this war?
It does have the potential to complicate things further. Remember, American forces are not taking part in this war, but
right.
As you mentioned earlier, the U.S. has said that they're kind of legitimate targets. And so if you think about U.S. weapons being used against North Korean forces, that's an additional complicating factor in the Asia-Pacific region, potentially.
That's Missy Ryan of the Washington Post. Missy, thanks so much.
Thanks.
It's Here and Now.
Dua Lipa usually plays for thousands in stadiums, but she recently stopped by NPR to play a much smaller venue, the Tiny Desk.
When you're just stood there in front of the microphone and you just can see eye to eye with so many people, it makes it so much more intimate. I crave moments like that.
Hear that conversation about her performance and new album on All Things Considered from NPR News.
And when the night ends up in tears, wake up and we flame it all.
Also, you may be hearing a lot about misinformation this election cycle. The goal of misinformation is to keep you stuck in your beliefs.
When you see something that makes you feel like you are 100% right and you've always been right, that's a cue to stop and check it out.
Learn more about misinformation and how you can spot it on All Things Considered, starting at 4 this afternoon on WUSF 89.7, where support comes from contributing businesses like Tampa Bay Solar. Learn how your business can support WUSF by giving Jerry Patterson a call. You can reach Jerry at 800-741-9090. Sarasota Opera presents the music of Giuseppe Verdi, November 15th and 17th. Artistic director Victor Dorenzi leads the Sarasota Orchestra in famous Verdi arias performed by Sarasota Opera principal artists. Tickets at sarasotaopera.org. Thanks for tuning in today. You're listening to WUSF 89.7.
Funding for Here and Now comes from WBUR Boston and BetterHelp, committed to supporting mental health through therapy and helping clients find balance. Clients are matched with one of 35,000 therapists for online therapy from anywhere at betterhelp.com/public.
It's Here and Now. We are less than 2 weeks before the election, and yesterday afternoon, we spoke to one of the most well-known political consultants of the last several decades, Democrat James Carville. A new documentary is out. It's called Carville: Winning is Everything, Stupid.
James is a legend. He had done something extraordinary.
It's the economy, stupid.
James is in the business of winning elections.
And James Carville joins us now. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you. I've listened to the program frequently.
You have written that you're confident Kamala Harris will win, and one reason you give is that the GOP, as you write, is a repeat loser. What do you mean?
Well, okay, 2016. He won. It was a distributional fluke, but he did win.
When Trump won in 16.
They lost badly in 18. He lost in 20. They lost in 2022. Remember, people were expecting a tsunami and a wave and all this nonsense. That never happened. So the truth of the matter is, Democrats have been winning elections consistently. And I do think that we have more party unity. It goes from Liz Cheney to AOC. We have more money. They're going to have to close well. And I'm a big believer, if you watch the movie, you can never be any better than you think you are. If we don't think we're going to win, we're not going to win. And I think we're going to win. And that's my story, and I believe it for good reason, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah, and you said one reason you think she'll win is because Americans, as you put it, are rational and reasonable. So I have to ask you, if Donald Trump wins, does that mean America has changed in a way that you, James Carville, don't even recognize?
Correct. Yes. It would not be, if you had the director of national intelligence under Donald Trump, who might be the most Republican guy in my career, Dan Coates. He was a Republican senator from Indiana.
Sure.
Everything about him just reeks that he's a Republican. He was the number one person in the intelligence community appointed by Trump. And he says that he thinks that Trump is a Russian agent. What else do you need to know? What else can be said? You had four-star generals, General Milley, General Kelly, said he's fastest to his bone. All right, you have all of this right in front of your face. And I don't believe that the United States that I live in and grew up in wants a person that wants to get rid of the Constitution. I can't allow myself to think that. And if that happens, I'll have to reconcile my massive disappointment and how we ended up here and whatever happened to the United States that I knew. But I'm not nearly remotely there because I think we're going to win.
A lot of Americans surely will ask, how is it this race is razor close when one candidate, as you've said, his closest advisors say he meets the definition of a fascist, convicted of felonies, liable for sexual assaults, indisputable liar?
Well, first of all, courts have said that. Okay, not just people saying. Secondly, we haven't lost yet. In every election in this century, and this will be the sixth one, in only 2008 did a candidate wake up on election day knowing they're going to win, and that was Obama in 2008. So let's count the votes before we have hand-wringing over the polls right now.
Can I ask it this way? I mean, if it's this close, as we're told it is, and one candidate has the record that he has, does that mean the Democratic Party is that a problem here?
So why are we anticipating something that hasn't happened yet?
No, I'm just saying it's so close.
I know.
Should it be this close?
But we don't know it's that close. We have to count the votes. And if we're obsessing on what the Democratic Party needs to learn as opposed to how do we, and I'm being respectful here, but everybody does the same thing. How do you explain this? Well, we haven't counted the votes yet. After it's over, come back and ask me, but I'm not into pre-election interpretation. I'm into winning the election.
One thing you've done in this cycle is you were central to the voice of Democrats to pressure Joe Biden to step aside. Some of that is in this documentary. After Biden's disastrous debate with Trump, I understand you turned off the tube after a few minutes, listened to Hank Williams rather than watched. When you raised your voice then, surely you got pushback from the Democratic establishment.
Well, first of all, I was sort of saying this back in early 23. I had thought it out, and I knew what was likely to be the reaction to it. The advantage that I have over most people is no one pays me. There's nothing to fire me from. I was in a unique position where I really was only accountable to me. You have to be very late in life to get to that place.
I understand you have a birthday upcoming this week. You're going to turn 80 Friday. So you are in the age group of Donald Trump and of Joe Biden. And I want to ask you, is there something personal about your observation about age, politics, mental acuity?
100%. Because I am experiencing aging. And unlike most people, I have some vague idea of what the job entails. And I just didn't think they were compatible. You know, when I was 70, I clocked off 4 sub 9-minute miles.
Wow.
I was feeling pretty good. I couldn't clock off 4 sub 20-minute miles now. All right? But I mean, the point is, everybody has experience with aging. Either you going through it, or your parents went through it, or your neighbors went through it. It's not an abstract thing.
Well, I mean, so you saw something in Biden as far as age. What do you see in Donald Trump?
So let's take the NPR audience right now is in James Carville's class. All right? If people coming to you saying, Donald Trump has cognitive issues. He doesn't have it anymore. He had a 39-minute listening to Ave Maria. He doesn't have it anymore. We should run against that. And another side says he has authoritarian impulses. 2 4-star generals said he's fascist to his bone. His own director of national intelligence says he thinks that he's an agent of the Russian government. So if you say both things, people are going to say, wait a minute. So this guy doesn't know where he is. He's incompetent and incontinent, but he's going to be authoritarian and in the U.S. Constitution. It's what I would call a contradictory message. He's either cognitively in serious decline, which is probably true, and he's really dangerous, and he has huge anti-democratic impulses, and is in all likelihood totally compromised by the Russian government. You got to pick one. And if you have, as you do, a very educated and sophisticated audience, I could probably explain to them why both is true, but that's only because you have a very educated, sophisticated audience. That's not the general public.
Yeah. Well, and I should say the incontinent part, we probably need to subject that to a fact check, but let me ask you.
I happen to believe that it's true, but I don't think that's the closing message here.
Well, that's what I want to ask you about is the closing message. You just mentioned several things that you think the Harris campaign should emphasize in its closing message. What do you make of its closing message? Because you have said, I'm not so sure how good the Harris campaign is at trench warfare.
My advice to them is to be meaner, be more focused, and be more direct. And also act like you're a winner. Just go out and be a winner. Don't have all the namby-pamby second guessing, and I don't know if we have any democratic impulses in this country, and he's just a misogynist and a racist, and what are we going to do, James? Get your butt out there and win the election. That's what you do.
So what is that direct message?
He is a threat to what the United States is. He is a threat to the idea of the United States. He's a threat to the security of the United States. He's a threat to the way that we live, period. That means you can't talk about J.D. Vance in the couch, all right? You have to be very focused and very singular in your approach.
Particularly, right, if Trump loses or the outcome is unclear, his MAGA team is expected once again to flood the social media zone with falsehoods, litigation. Some litigation is already preceded. Do you think Democrats, the Harris campaign, have an adequate plan for that?
I'm a person that lives totally in the present, all right? How do we dominate the news cycle today? I cannot allow myself to think the day after the election. But there are people that have, to be fair. They have teams of lawyers that are in place. But, you know, my idea is just win, baby, just win.
We have seen Kamala Harris campaigning to try to lure never-Trumpers from the GOP. Do you sense that's a good tactic? They could also target lower-income voters who don't vote very often. I mean, where should they focus their attention to broaden their voting base?
I think the key voting bloc in this election that has the most elasticity, that means the greatest thing to go up, are college-educated white males. If she wins, I think that's the demographic group that will take her across the finish line.
James Carville, he and his career are profiled in the new documentary Carville, Winning is Everything Stupid. And James Carville, once again, happy birthday. Thanks for the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, big fan of your network, and glad to be on here. Thank you very much.
This is Here and Now.
Live from NPR News in Boston, I'm Steve Brown. An Israeli strike on a school where displaced people were sheltering in central Gaza killed at least 17 people today, according to Palestinian medical officials. Nearly all the victims were women and children. Another 42 people were wounded in the strike in the built-up Nuseirat camp. The Israeli military said it was targeting Hamas militants who were hiding out among civilians in the school. Meanwhile, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited Qatar today as part of his 11th visit to the region since the war began. The U.S. hopes to renew the negotiations after Israeli forces killed top Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar in Gaza last week, but neither side has shown any sign of moderating its demands. Louisiana officials have begun moving a homeless encampment near the Superdome in New Orleans just days before 3 weekend concerts by Taylor Swift. A spokesperson for Governor Jeff Landry says the move was part of an effort to help the city put its best foot forward ahead of the Swift concerts and February's Super Bowl. Advocates for homeless people were critical, however, saying the unexpected move disrupts progress in finding long-term housing for those affected. You're listening to Here and Now.
You may know firsthand that chronic stress can lead to unhealthy behaviors, and it can also increase the risk of everything from heart disease to dementia. But did you know that a little stress sometimes can be helpful? Learn about that in 1 minute with Here and Now. And if one of the things that you do to feel better is treat yourself to a little something every day, maybe you want to know about an Italian food option. This week on the Zest podcast, you can visit Donatello Italian Restaurant in Tampa. They've been in business 40 years, so they must be doing something right. You can hear The Zest wherever you get your podcasts or at thezestpodcast.com, brought to you in part by Adelaide Interiors. Support for WUSF 89.7 comes in part from people like you who listen and donate. Super big thanks. Support also comes from Caldwell Trust Company, an organization which has been navigating clients toward their financial goals since 1993, building wealth and preserving legacy the way it's meant to be. Learn more at ctrust.com.
Funding for Here and Now comes from the listeners of WBUR Boston and from your NPR station. From MathWorks, creators of MATLAB and Simulink software for technical computing and model-based design. MathWorks, accelerating the pace of discovery in engineering and science. Learn more at mathworks.com. And Rhodes Scholar, a not-for-profit educational travel organization offering adventures for adults in more than 100 countries. Learn more at roadscholar.org/explore.
It's Here and Now. This may be the wrong time to think you can eliminate stress, but can you manage it better? Reframe how you think about it. As part of our Stress Less series, NPR's Allison Aubrey asked, when can stress be beneficial?
There's no doubt that chronic stress is bad for our health, but acute stress in the moments amid a challenging situation is different. You know that feeling when your palms get a little clammy and your heart rate speeds up just before you do something that you're nervous to do. Dan Harris describes this is the way he felt before a recent TV appearance.
In the seconds before I went on, I was kind of pacing around backstage, still nervous, just reminding myself over and over again. Stress and anxiety are totally normal.
The appearance went great, and that's probably not a surprise given all his experience. Harris is a former TV reporter and now hosts a podcast, 10% Happier. So why did he experience some of the classic signs of a stress response? Well, he's come to think of sweaty palms and nerves as his body's way to prepare him to perform.
Instead of telling yourself,